had said to comment about Freud. He's here. It's the guy with the funky hair next talking to Robert. Which come up to me after I make this statement. Or he might want to come take up space and defend his point. And what do I respond?
Control center? No. General.
So we're going to stop 12:20? 25?
12. Let's shoot for 12:20. Absolutely, and 12:25.
And then open it up to discuss specific interventions. Then we move into, that's when we move into specific interventions.
Yeah, what did I put about that? Oh. Yeah, you're gonna talk a lot about things. I'm gonna add like what accessibility means as a universal concept, and then I'm gonna add creativity and art because that's an intervention. And I'm gonna talk a little bit about like my family being artists and how seeing that's how they and why that's so important.
So that's how we're going to conclude with our ways, what our goals are professionally to do with our careers. Right, to bring creativity and art. Is that what you're saying for that section?
I mean, I was thinking that that's kind of like a part of my intervention.
Okay.
I think it's gonna kind of like be the same.
Yeah.
From my interventions and my goals.
Okay.
But I also feel like the goals are to forever for me to ever be, you know, politicizing and thinking about what that means in the context of those markers that I know about.
Just so make sure. Let go of you. Avoid timelines, Diana.
It'll go we know this. This is how we live. It's not just like we're not just up here pretending to be somebody.
Okay, we have 1 more minute, and then we're going to get started. So we're going to switch after our clinical journey, and then you'll go about your intro. Oh no, intros first, then we switch.
The intro and clinical journey.
Yeah, and then we'll go to clinical afterwards. Okay, we're going to get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Diana Mena. I'm a clinical social worker from Seattle, Washington. My people come from Nicaragua, They immigrated after the revolution. So I'm first generation Latin American. And I want to take a minute to honor the ancestors and the descendants in this room that are sharing space with us. In particular, for me, my maternal lineage, the women who have come before me and whose lives and resiliency I've based my practice off of. To all the esperanzas out there. I want to honor the caretakers of this land, and I honor you by doing my best to caretake to myself, to my community, and the land that we're embodying right now. Can we turn off that light, actually? I can't see anybody. I'd like to start just by talking about my clinical journey. So as I mentioned, I'm a first generation college student, first generation immigrant to this country, oldest daughter, so I carried a lot of weight on my shoulders to perform and do well. I'm the first person to go to college, first person to go to grad school, and I'm already feeling emotional, which is why this isn't a conference, because I'm not here to follow the ways that conferences perform. I'm doing my own practice. And so I'm first gen. Going to grad school as a brown person is not easy, but I managed to get into the Masters of Social Work and graduate, and where I met my great friend Paloma. And after that, I graduated and went on to community mental health, where I spent 3 years working towards my license with the hope of being able to do this work in a liberatory way and not the way that community mental health is supposed to how it limits us and keeps us from actually being our true selves and do the radical praxis that we actually want to be doing. So 3 years ago, I was forced to quit because of the exploitation and oppression that occurs within those systems. And I started my private practice, and that was not easy because, again, I have no models for what entrepreneur is. My mom, as a single mom, her goal for me was to go to a good college, get a good job, so I could have some sense of structure and stability. So no, entrepreneurship and business and clinical practice on my terms was never modeled to me. So my clinical journey started at grad school, where I had access to training, and there was an opportunity to study at the Harborview Center for Sexual Assault and Traumatic Stress, where I got my training. 50 people interviewed, and I was the one that was chosen. And for me, it was a beautiful thing because I thought that I was going to learn how to be a trauma therapist. That's where we learn CBT, that's where we learn CPT, that's where we learn the latest evidence-based therapies. And as the supervisor said while I was there, the only way to treat trauma. And I believed it because at that time, again, I'm a first-generation student. I thought that education was the sole exit to success and stability for me and my people. So I drank the Kool-Aid, and for the 3 years I was in community mental health, I practiced CBT. I practiced a lot of these evidence-based therapies, but nothing felt right because that's not who I am as a person. And so it wasn't actually until I began my private practice that I felt I could be my true liberated self. And through my private practice, I have been able to unpack, decolonize, deconstruct, and radicalize what therapy should look like in practice, especially for my people and communities of color and activists of color who are here to do the radical work of undoing these systems of oppression that have a very real impact on our mental, emotional, spiritual health. So earlier, yesterday actually, I posed the question of whether psychology can actually be a tool of decolonization in terms of using Audre Lorde's statement around master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And the response, which was sadly shortened, was that Freud and the fathers of psychology weren't being discussed when Audre Lorde made that statement. And I'm going to use my presentation to thoroughly disagree with that because I think it was exactly who Audre Lorde was questioning and pushing back on, these forefathers of psychology. And I am embodying that argument through my work and my practice.
Thank you, Diana. My name is Paloma Andazolo-Reza. I am originally from New Mexico. My family is from Taos, Valdez and Arroyo Seco. I went to high school in Albuquerque. I came about this journey through such a long process. I left New Mexico because I knew when I was in high school that I was queer. And at that time in the 90s, it wasn't safe to be out. My family is very involved with the church here and knows a lot of people, and I didn't feel like I would have the ability to be who I fully was. That was the hardest decision I ever made because my family and my community and my culture are everything to me. So I left. I went on this long-winded journey, ended up in Washington State because somebody somewhere had told me that that was where it was safe for me to be me. I realized very quickly that I didn't fit there either. As a Chicana, mestiza from northern New Mexico, you know, rural community, close community. So it was this really interesting navigation of going through, figuring out who I was, who I am, and how to be whole. I really resisted the field of mental health and psychology. I found it to be very pathologizing of our communities and our cultures. As a queer person, you know, we were in the DSM saying that there was something pathologically wrong with us for loving who we love. But I also recognized that I came from a community. When I was in high school, I was kicked out when I was 17. I was heavy into drugs. I was really struggling. I was homeless in Albuquerque for a while. And, you know, I recognized that the struggles in our families and our communities were big. But I also recognized that there were ways that our communities were helping each other, and there were ways that we were helping to heal each other. And I knew that, but I didn't quite understand what that meant. So I got into school. I got my degree in ethnic studies and history. I focused on Chicano and indigenous studies, and I focused on human rights in Latin America and resistance through art. And I had amazing mentors that helped me through that and were representations of my community. And so I think that helped me to believe that I belonged there. And eventually, I'd been doing social services, working in domestic violence shelters, working with people with disabilities as a caregiver. And I finally realized that my passion was for social justice, and I applied to be a social worker. So I went into social work school, and I realized that I did not want to have anything to do with the mental health track. I still was feeling like there's no way I'm going to sit there and listen to the pathologization of people and their pain and their struggle and their trauma. But I also was very drawn to that because I understood it very well. So I focused on community-centered practices, community-centered integrative practice, and in that I discovered mental health and mental wellness and what that means. I focused on community-centered practices of healing from trauma in northern New Mexico. I started looking into what people were doing in multicultural mental health, and I started realizing all of the ways that my family, as I was going through school, were helping each other and helping their communities through crisis. My entire family is artists and musicians, and I started to realize that the way my family healed was through art. So, you know, I went through this journey, and I worked in systems, and I started just realizing all of these systems and all of these ways that we still continue to oppress people, that we are actually creating trauma systemically and systematically. And I was like, wow, there's got to be a different way. We are actually reproducing the traumas that people are feeling, and we're not granting access to people. So I started thinking about my own clinical private practice. I just started about a year ago. You know, being a business owner is just unbelievable. Like, I never thought I would be in that position. And it requires you to think a lot about what that means. And being a clinician and being somebody who wants to do it differently, while recognizing that what I learned in school, there was great value for that. And there are, you know, CBT does have its place, but it is not the answer. Our answers are in integrative care. We have to be culturally responsive. We have to be culturally integrative. I believe that being a politicized healer, which is what I call myself, I don't necessarily call myself a clinician or a psychotherapist. I call myself a politicized healer because I believe that healing exists within the context of people's lives. So we can't focus just on the individual. We have to focus on the lives and the context that they come from and what is happening and the things they are being impacted by. So Deanna and I and other people, I live in Seattle, Washington now. I've been there for about 8 years. I come back home very frequently. I really want to honor my ancestors because they are everything that got me here. Even if they didn't know how to read, or even if, my parents work 3 jobs 7 days a week. And I just honor their work and their wisdom in this. Because I went to school, it does not mean that I have this expert knowledge in how this goes. It means that I'm a deeper listener to the wisdom and the knowledge of the people that came before me. So I honor them, and I honor my home, and I honor these communities here that are brilliant. And I hope that through these things, that communities can understand that the wisdom that we have, the knowledge that's been passed down, is actually our brilliance and our healing and our knowledge and wisdom too. And that has just as much place in this room and in these institutions as these dominant narratives about what psychology is about.
Badass. Cool. Well, I just think our existence is so radical. Like, this is radical praxis. Like, if we, the fact that we exist, the fact that we made it, the fact that we're here, the fact that we're business owners, the fact that we're seeing our own people, and reclaiming our own restorative ways, our ways of traditional healing, and incorporating it in order to dissect and deconstruct psychology, and this idea that the white male wealthy is a universal experience for all of us, when it is not. And it's actually not the solution to trauma. We have to reclaim so many aspects of who we are, unpack all of these different layers and complex relationships in order to get to this place of actually being embodied and healed people. So when I think about my private practice, I always think to myself, I don't want to run this like the dominant narrative. I don't want to run my practice like white women, which are 90% of therapists out there, and they're working under the gaze of white men and these white forefathers, and have not had access to the women, to the black women, to the women of color, to our indigenous ancestors, to be able to feel as if we're experts in our own healing. And so we have to unpack all of those different layers if we're actually going to be critical of psychology as it is. And so my clinical activism comes in many forms. I believe wholeheartedly that the political is personal and the personal is political. And if you're not seeing psychology as political, that's problematic. And it's problematic because of this universalism that we're talking about and that we continue to spread through conferences, through books that we write, through who's teaching our students and who's not doing the work that's necessary for all of our liberation. So the psychology is always political. There is no neutrality in this. You're coming from a specific perspective, and you're going to look for the solutions that support that and uphold that reasoning. And you're going to create experiments, and you're going to create evidence-based therapies that treat the narratives that you have constructed from the beginning. And so it's up to brown folks and it's up to indigenous folks to really push back and question for our own humanity's sake, for our own survival. Because even though traditional therapy and evidence-based therapies and CBT got me through my own trauma work, I know that that's not going to get me to the next level, and it's not going to create the intergenerational healing that I need to do so that my kids experience something different. So nothing is neutral. Everything is non-neutral. So the work I do is about consciousness raising, my own and the people I'm working with. We need to talk about how psychology has been used as a tool of oppression. We need to talk about how it upholds white supremacy and patriarchy. We need to deconstruct diagnoses and see it as the social construct that it is, and how it shifts whenever it has political gains for the status quo. We need to talk about consumerism, capitalism, and insurance. We need to talk about appropriation of indigenous science. In particular, I'm thinking about mindfulness. I'm thinking about how self-care has been the new monotonized and consumerized intervention, where the end goal is always individualism, not community. I'm thinking about pathologizing, which Paloma mentioned earlier, and how psychology has been used to pathologize people, including enslaved people who wanted to escape slavery. All of this has been diagnosed in the DSM, or were seen as addendums at the back for, what's it called? Sorry, go ahead. Culturally bound syndromes, right? We're an afterthought. Same with evidence-based therapies, where like it's all like studied under white, wealthy college students or middle-class students, and then we go and figure out if it works for Native folks, and then we go if it figures out if it works for immigrants, and then we tell them that we know what's right for them, right? Even though it's the very systems that psychology upholds that are actually making our people sick. So I'm thinking a lot about self-awareness and how people of color are constantly thinking about self-awareness and themselves and who they are and what their identities are and the people they're carrying on their shoulders and the people that will come. And I think psychology needs to learn and unpack why there is not that lack of self-awareness, why there's such an ego, right? Why there's this an expert panel, and we throw out theories that don't really make sense to people who aren't in academia, right? Who isn't reachable to community, and just white folks in general that aren't doing the unpacking about their own lineages, their own ancestry, their own roles in oppressing other peoples in colonization, even in the critical psychology field. Like, there were so many triggers during this conference of white male toxic masculinity showing up, and the fact that the very people that are critiquing psychology are still embodying these systems of oppression is very concerning, because what happens are a whole bunch of micro assaults that shake me and shake us and leave us ungrounded and unable to learn because we're already in that trauma, fight, flight, intergenerational response. So I think psychology needs to unpack the ego, this need for power and acknowledgement and expert status, and how biases show up in those ways.
All that. So my approach, when I think about what does it mean to be a politicized healer, I want to be really clear what that means for me and where that lies in my action, in my daily life, and how I live in the world and the person I want to be, and how that rests in how I'm showing up for people in my clinical practice. I said before, I think we need to stop individualizing trauma. So my focus is on trauma, and I work, with people who experience complex trauma, collective trauma, and we need to be broader. I'm a broad thinker, so my perspective is there's an individual sitting in my office who is hurting deeply and who has experienced these individual traumas, but are also, as a person of color, as a queer person, as a person with a disability, as a person with a larger body, is sitting there also having to go out into the world and experience all of the oppression, all of the stigma, all of the prejudice, all of the inaccessibility of the bodies that they live in. So when I'm working with a person, we're looking at, okay, what are the things that have impacted you in your life? And it's not just, I was raped, I'm a survivor of childhood trauma, and it happened in my community, and it's happening in all these communities. So does that automatically make your community more violent, more bad, more hostile? I think that comes into play a lot. We talk about communities with a lot of violence, but we're not unpacking what that actually means, and the reality that, somebody asked me one time, oh, you had to, move away from home. I'm so glad that you were able to get away and come to the Northwest where you could be yourself. And, I'm so sorry your community was so homophobic. And I'm like, this community is homophobic. It didn't change, it just looks different. The homophobia shows up and looks different. And in that moment, they were saying that my racialized community was so much more homophobic. And so we have to start looking at how trauma exists for people, systemically, institutionally, historically, intergenerationally, and how experiences of oppression shape everyday lives. I have a friend who lives with a very visible disability, who's a woman of color, and she called me one time and she was like, I have to go out into the world every day. I'm going to therapy and I'm doing this healing work, and then bam, the minute I walk out the door, somebody says something racist, somebody says something about my disability. How am I ever going to heal when that's the situation? And I mean, that's a hard thing to answer. You know, how do we heal when we're always being targeted based on our race, our gender, our disability, our LGBTQ, whether we identify as LGBTQ, our genders, our gender identities. So my practice in politicized healing is that healing is resistance to oppression. So it is grounded in the fact that we heal because we are going to resist oppression. And that's the biggest, most powerful thing we can do to start. I believe healing is cultural and community resilience. Healing needs to be focused on what does liberation truly look like. And it's always within that deeper context of where does the healing take place? What is the complexity of the people and their histories? You know, like Diana said, nothing is neutral in healing. Nothing is neutral in mental health therapy. So I work from a place of anti-racism, race consciousness, intersectionality. So, you know, I'm light-skinned. There are so many ways that I have had passes, that I have had privileges, that I have access, that I have had gains, that I know my brother who's darker skinned don't get. My family doesn't get. So I have to understand what being anti-racist means for me and my community. Being race conscious, I think there's this idea that if we're colorblind and see people all as equal, I mean, we're still carrying that colorblindness, but we have to be conscious of the fact that race informs everything. It impacts everything. And race, yes, it's a construction, it's false, but it has shaped everything that we are and have come to be. I focus on intersectionality, of course, because being queer and being a person of color, I also live with an invisible disability. We have to understand that those things interconnect with each other. Kimberly Crenshaw was the one who talks about intersectionality. We have to understand those interconnect and create their own experience in people. I'm a very strong avid worker of disability justice. I work on what it means to decolonize, work on indigenous healing and honoring and collaborative. So Diana and I do work around what are our traditional practices from our communities. We've worked with traditional practices within curanderismo, and how does that fit into how we're working from a mental health perspective, working somatically. And I work from an LGBTQ responsive and affirmative place. I work to be culturally responsive and integrative. That means I'm not the expert, even if we're from the same community. I don't know what your family history has been or what your journey has been. I get to know and understand how I can best help and support you in understanding that. And also recognize that I may not always be the right person for that. That sometimes we need the person that is the right person to help us understand that, because honestly, just in my own experiences of healing, which I am still undergoing, because I identify as a survivor of very complex trauma and a very hard things. And we have to understand for ourselves that disconnection from our cultures and our communities and what that means ancestrally and how that happened, that is profound healing. And so if we can find the right person that understands that and can help support and facilitate that with all the other stuff, because CBT has helped me too. So it's integrative. So the way that I work from a politicized healer perspective is integrative. I do value and community-centered practices. I do think community is a great source of healing for us. And I value interdependency, which means that we don't act as individuals who are, pushing through and we just have to take care of ourselves and heal ourselves and do it all in isolation. I don't believe healing happens in isolation. And my gauge for whether or not something is going to be relevant or work is I think about my family. And I think, would they be able or feel comfortable or feel like this is resonant with them, to walk into this building, to walk into this office, to work with me in a way that feels comfortable. You know, my brother, I was just actually like, just a few months ago talking to him about starting my own practice, and he was like, what do you do? And I was trying to explain to him what I did, and he couldn't comprehend it because, you know, northern New Mexico for so long, we didn't even have a hospital up there, let alone having access to mental health treatment that is often not mandated by court systems. And so, yeah, just explaining to people. So I always think about my family as my gauge for how that happens. And, you know, going on this journey, oh, and I want to say one more thing. The other thing that I support in a politicized healing perspective is fierce embodiment, fat liberation, and body trust. So we are so dissociated from our bodies, and we politicize and we pathologize bodies in so many ways. And so we need to understand that people's bodies need to be honored and centered in that process too. And we need to think about the ways people's bodies are attacked that lead to additional trauma. I feel like, you know, there's very real things that people do to survive and navigate the very real consequences of trauma. And I feel like that in itself gets pathologized. We tend to say, you know, people do these things, you know, because they're bad or, you know, they're criminal. People do things to survive, and we can't pathologize what people do to try to survive, but we also have to help them understand that it's not sustainable for us and it's not sustainable for our communities. And our sense of liberation and their sense of healing is going to be bound up with dismantling these systems and this collective resistance. So I don't just study in my practice and go home and work. Like, the community is everything. I need to stay connected to what community needs, what community wants, what's going on for community, how community is being impacted, and not just my community in Seattle, my community here as well. And they're the teachers for me. They're the ones who help guide me in understanding how I can do it differently, because honestly, we're having to figure that out. We learned the tools. We learned those dominant narratives, and we know them so well. And we're using them. We're using them to help our communities, but we're also figuring out there's other ways that need to be honored. So I'm an expressive arts therapist, and art is a very huge foundation of the way that I work, because I also think that our creative spirits are really, really powerful, and I know it's been powerful for my family and community in their own healing. I've seen it firsthand.
Yeah, I also want to add that this work is emotional. Like, I've been tearing up all this entire time, but it's emotional, it's political, it's physical, it's mental. And there's a very real split in psychology where the white man decided that the brain and the mind were separate from the body. And I think part of our radical resistance to that is how do we bring the mental, the emotional, the physical, and the spiritual aspects to our healing? How do we reclaim that through our traditional ways, while also incorporating the good that psychology has brought forth for us? But it's very emotional. And if you try to tell me that in order to be professional, I have to not cry with a client, I'm going to say, F that. Clients should see me cry because it's deeply emotional, it's deeply personal, it's deeply political. So I want to transition into how we actually do this radical practice. And one of the ways I do that is by acknowledging that it's emotional and validating when people have emotions. Rage is valid given our social constructs and the world we're living in right now. And it can't always be resolved with deep breathing and mindfulness. Right? Like we have to break things, and we have to be mad, and we have to organize. And how can we, what I try to do with clients is how do we make that rage sustainable, right? Because yesterday, Dr. Tom Curry talked about how the extermination of brown and black bodies is part of white supremacy. And so that's what white supremacy does in terms of our mental health. It drives us crazy. It has me doubting whether that microassault actually happened, and it's not till the other women of color in the room tell me, oh, that was fucked up, that I'm acknowledging my own reality in these spaces. And so my goal is always radicalization of the people I'm seeing. My goal is always to validate and normalize things like rage, sadness, intergenerational trauma, and also resiliency. It's about psychoeducation and knowledge sharing. and seeing people as the experts on their own lives and their own communities, but also moving away from the black and white concepts, right? Because it's complicated and it's complex and it's messy, and it's not like white supremacy tells us that healing is linear, right? Or hierarchical, or that we go through developmental stages. We don't. It's very circular. We go back and forth and learn the same lessons over and over again in different ways. And our goal is for, at least my goal for my clients, is that they experience less intensity and less duration, right? So that we can make this work and this radicalization and this revolution and this rebellion be sustainable for the long term, right? And it hasn't been. I work with so many activists of color that think that they can't eat, that they can't take breaks, that they have to be at every march, at every protest, otherwise they're not real activists. They're not actually down with the cause, and that's not sustainable for our people. And so I try to unpack that and talk about how we have internalized capitalism, how we've internalized productivity, how we've internalized this superhero complex that we're the only person that can do this because no one else will step up if we don't do it ourselves. And so all the ways that we've internalized white supremacy and our own oppression, and how we continue to engage in those tactics with our own people within activist circles, things like disposability politics, right? Where like, you're canceled if you say it wrong, or I'm canceled as a presenter because I started out crying when I talked about my ancestors. So how do we move away from that, right? How do we say that's not how we're going to internalize this? And I think we do that by allowing for complexity, right? It's complicated. And activism doesn't always look like being on the front lines. It looks like sitting on our couches, like doing therapy with people, right? And unpacking this. And sometimes
Having
it looks
pláticas.
like having pláticas and licking envelopes, right? Because everybody is contributing to the greater revolution, and it doesn't have to look like we think or been told by Marx or whomever, or whatever white guy told us that this is the way revolution works, right? We have to redefine that for ourselves. And we do that by experiencing joy. We do that by experiencing pleasure, by experiencing relationship, and bring our communities with us. We do so much. It's ridiculous, actually. But I always want to talk about self-care as community care, right? Because we have to move away from the individual to community, right? And a lot of indigenous science and knowledge is about, like, how do we... So I think about college, right? Like, in so many ways, like in undergrad, I was told I was so great because I made it to college, and how, like, I had to leave my community behind in order to get there. And I tell my first-gen college students that that's true. You do have to turn your back on community sometimes. And white supremacy will jump on that and tell you that you're the cream of the crop, and you're the best thing to come out of community, and you're not like the people you left back home. But the work we have to do is to get the license, get the degree, go back to community, right? Because when we care for ourselves and we liberate ourselves, we have to go back and pull somebody forward. So I think a lot about black and brown love, right? Like, how do we love each other profoundly? Like, not in an intimate, like, hypersexualized way, but how do I love, like, the other women of color in this room? How do I not compete with you? How do I bring you up so that we can interrupt our intergenerational trauma? Other ways of interventions?
I mean, for me, the goals with folks I work with, I learned this from working with traditional healers, is that we are our most powerful healers. And we're not told that, especially when we experience trauma, when we're told in all these different ways that our knowledge is not valuable or relevant. So my goal is to help somebody, like Deanna said, lessen the intensity, lessen the duration, figure out how to navigate, but also how can you become your own healer? I'm not the expert in your healing, and I'm not the one doing your healing. You are. So how can I support and facilitate that with a person? I also believe that we just need to empower people's wholeness in all of who they are and their complexity. I know that the most powerful thing that I think that really led me through this was getting a degree in ethnic studies. And, I grew up with a very strong sense of culture, a very strong sense of my own history. And, I have books of my family lineage and what my grandparents, my great-grandparents, my great-great-grandparents have put together. But I went to school and I realized how much wasn't taught in my own community about amazing stuff that happened in my own community, amazing resistance. And that was a real wake-up call for me in understanding, oh, I have this place, and who I am was erased in all of these different ways. Who my family is, who our communities are invisible. So for me, it's also helping to empower people in their wholeness and understanding that where they come from is powerful and important.
Yeah, so we have 5 minutes, and we just want to know if this resonates with in particular, the BIPOC, non-conforming, gender-conforming, oppressed people. And if you have any other suggestions about how we can radicalize this work. Shout out.
Yes, it resonated.
How? Why?
To my heart.
So we're doing good work, is what you're saying.
So why do you think that's important?
Which piece?
The fact that it spoke to your heart and it resonated, like in doing this work.
I mean, even just thinking about conferences and academia, it used to be such a cold place. And to feel like the love that you're talking about, which is rooted in solidarity, and to really being fearless in the face of speaking truth to power, and just being like, this is what's going on, and instead of having us running around thinking like we're, lack of a better word, we're crazy, because no one else is saying it, and it's just healing for you too to just be up there, and to just be speaking your truth and talking about all the ways in which you're navigating your work and dealing with the complexities and naming that.
Thank you for saying that. And I just want to say, it's so hard. I mean, it's so amazing, but it's so hard to do. And hearing that from you makes it so much easier. It's so nice to connect with you in that.
Hello. I just want to thank you for sharing that information and your personal stories. And my question is, what is your advice to people of color who are trying to enter these fields that are normally white-dominated? And I myself I'm trying to enter this field and be a clinician and help both of my communities. I am Mexican and Native American. I belong to the Diné, or the Navajo Nation. And I just would like to know what your advice to...
I'm so glad you exist. Thank you for being so resilient and for making that decision and that choice for your people. We need you.
Yeah, we all need each other. My abuelo, who just passed, always told me, never forget where you come from. You'll be told a lot of things that will make you question that. And your family, your community, your culture is your greatest strength and your greatest foundation. So never forget where you come from. Take what is useful, because there is useful stuff. It is valuable, and it is critical and important that we do this work, and we need people like you in this field, because this field's going to change. It's going to continue to evolve because of people like you. So just never forget where you come from, and honor and listen to the wisdom of your ancestors, because they know they have so much to offer in this field.
And I would say in terms of sustainability, speak truth to power in those classes and in those courses, and also don't. Make it sustainable for yourself and back the fuck up and shut up and sit in the back and just get your degree, get your license, so you can do whatever the fuck you want for your people.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for talking about the body.
Yeah.
Well, it's crazy. You all should read In My Grandmother's Hands by Resma Menaken, especially the brown folks in the room and the white folks, because he has an entire chapter dedicated to white body supremacy and how a lot of times we, again, psychology split the mind from the body, but so we think that anti-racism is something logical that we can do when it's actually embodied intergenerationally. And so even if you think you're anti-racist, you're going to behave in racist ways because we haven't healed the somatics. And so the book is called My Grandmother's Hands, Resma Menaken. He's super powerful.
Thank you all so much for listening.
Hi, my name is Danielle Kofelt, and I'm so sorry.
All right, so we're starting right now.
Okay, everyone, thank you for joining us. And this is the panel on pedagogy. And I guess I'm just going to go up and start. Okay. Great, so our panel is called Decolonizing Pedagogy, Exploring Liberatory Methods and Assignments in and Outside the Classroom. I'm Bob Maisler. My colleagues Christine Rosales and Danielle Kofeld will join me as well in these presentations. We are coming from California to New Mexico, and we are visitors here on Pueblo territory, and we want to honor the 19 Pueblo tribes in which we are guests by taking a moment of silence. Okay, so my talk is called Knowing When to Get Out of the Way, Growing the Third University Within the First. And there's my email address. Please feel free to stay in touch with me, and if you have any questions that don't get answered. I want to start with, I believe that context is super important, and as many of the folks have talked about, that there are no universals, so where we are coming from and our positionalities matters quite a bit for teaching. And so I want to introduce myself. I'm a white, cis masculine settler in the ancestral homelands of the Amamutsin tribal band, who have been fighting waves of colonization for 500 years, and they are still very much there and very much fighting in this area, and we are in solidarity with them when we're doing this decolonizing work in our classrooms at UC Santa Cruz. I ground myself in critical pedagogy and psychology, and there's a long tradition of critical pedagogy within psychology. I believe that the folks who have done it before me and who have mentored me have created space for decolonizing work within psychology, and some of those folks are Aaronette White, Ignacio Martin Baró, and Franz Fanon. And I believe that they and many others have created spaces for decades, if not centuries, pushing on the dominant threads of psychology, and through this idea of solidarity with the oppressed that Ignacio Martin Baró and Franz Fanon talk about. I was introduced to their work through Aaronette White, who was my mentor at UC Santa Cruz, an amazing radical black feminist psychologist who left this earth in 2012, and we miss her dearly, but her work is still very much out there, and I recommend folks looking her work up. It's amazing. It's incredibly radical and intersectional. She introduced me to Ignacio Martin Baró, a Jesuit priest who was slain in El Salvador by U.S.-backed death squads in 1989, and the psychiatrist Franz Fanon, who, of course, is very important in critical theory, but was a psychiatrist working with folks in Algeria in the revolutionary front there. All three of these psychologists put their bodies on the line, and I honor them in this presentation. So this presentation, my thesis here is that the third university exists within the first, and this is something that I've developed after reading my work in the classroom and then reading the works of La Popperson, the pseudonym of K. Wayne Yang, who talks about the third university, and before I bring this quote up, existing within the first university. So this is a somewhat of a reframing of decolonizing work, where sometimes there's this idea that decolonizing work happens out there, that the university is either too far gone, too far lost as a colonial institution, or simply it can't happen, that there are no folks doing the work at the university. And that's simply not true. Popperson takes this idea of third university from third cinema, which I'm no expert in. However, this idea of third cinema is this revolutionary cinema emerging from Latin America that challenges the hegemony of Hollywood and first world cinema. So Popperson is saying that actually this radical revolutionary work is happening in the first university if we attend to it. So the Third World University defines itself as a decolonial project, as an interdisciplinary, transnational, yet vocational university that equips its students with skills toward the applied practice of decolonization. And Popperson cites the example of Ta-Nehisi Coates' description of the Mecca in Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me. The way that Coates talks about the Mecca at Howard University as a network of radical black scholars, a beacon for the black diaspora, is an example of the ways in which the third university is happening within the first. Of course, Howard is a historically black university, but it has in some ways had to cater to the whim or to the demands of neoliberalism. So it's this Mecca aspect of Howard that Coates is developing within this book, and Popperson says is possible at other universities. So if the third university exists within the first, what are the implications for pedagogy and the classroom? And I just want to show this image to give a more of a sense. So I showed you that image of the slug that's our mascot at UCSC. Some of my students who are active in the Me Too movement reappropriated this image, and reappropriation is an important piece of the third university, according to Popperson. And at UC Santa Cruz, we've recently taken down a known predator who had been allowed to exist at the university for over a decade in spite of allegations, and students and survivors were instrumental in. This is the first firing of a professor at UCSC in 20 years, and a major win. Okay, so let me talk about the course a little bit and what this course is. And the course is an example of what the third university can look like in the classroom. And so the course itself is situated within this program we have at UCSC called the ASER program, Apprenticeship in Community Engaged Research. So this program itself is inspired by the works of Eve Tuck and Kei Wayne Yang. The idea is that for far too long, universities have sent their students out into the community in order to save the community with this deficit-based narrative. The ASER program turns inward and says, let's develop desire-based narratives and do research from there. This is situated within College 10 at UCSC, which is a social justice and community college. So what I'm trying to say here is that this is what this course is not always possible at different sites. So context is very, very important. At other sites, there's going to be conservative agendas dominating the classroom, white supremacy ideology that sets up the classroom, neoliberal ideologies. This class allowed the syllabus and the curriculum to really expand and grow third university. So myself, in setting up the syllabus, I base this a lot on Aziz Choudhury's work, who says that activist social movements have been building and doing research methodologies that academia has neglected for a long, long time, and the methodologies of social movements, such as archiving work, such as facilitation, such as building of direct action changing the world through direct action and studying that is something that academia and radical scholars could look at. This was the flyer for the class with artwork from the Zapatistas and then the water protectors at Standing Rock and Extinction Rebellion, highlighting that this was a class that is based in social movements and that students who are interested in social movements, this might be a class that's for them. So the three aspects of the pedagogical premise for this class is a decolonial framework while allowing for curriculum emergence. So what I really wanted in this class is that curriculum emerge. I think far too often, myself and colleagues overdetermine classes with so much reading, testing in certain ways, papers, and all these assignments. I really did not go into that. I had a few readings here and there, important decolonial readings, but I was very open to the emergence of what could happen through our shared discussions and what the students brought to the class. I wanted assignments that allowed students to build what they're already working on. Again, and I've fallen into this myself, that assignments that are sort of one-offs, the assignments for the assignment's sake. I was really interested in building assignments that really rooted in students in what they're already doing, because these were students who are activists and already working on research projects, that this course could amplify that or deepen their what they're already doing at the university. And finally, an intimate, brave space for critical conversation. So this was a smaller class, and intimate in the sense that we were very vulnerable with one another, sharing stories, and that allowed for each other to give, that students could give each other feedback on their projects and feel like they could do that. And a brave space, meaning that it's not a safe space in the sense that this is based on the sort of pedagogy of Frantz Fanon, a pedagogy of discomfort, that there's going to be messed up stuff that we bring into the classroom. We've been socialized into capitalist colonialism, and to make space for call-ins, for education, and that we are a community learning together. And that also entails responsibility and critical reflexivity, that we need to be looking at our own privileges, and that for those who have more privilege in the classroom, for the white students, the cis male students, they need to be looking at the ways in which their voices have been privileged, and that there's not a space to reproduce that privilege. Okay, so who and how in the classroom? 10 students, 2 auditors. Ethnically and racially diverse, gender identities were very diverse. First through fourth year students and 2 graduate students. We had a very diverse classroom in a lot of different ways, and that was a real strength for the students teaching each other. The classroom agreements on the first day, this is an element of brave space, creating brave space, that I introduced, that we're going to have classroom agreements, and we build these collectively. And what the prompt is, what do you need to make this a brave space for you? And the students came up with 11 agreements. It was a really rich and robust discussion. Some of my classrooms, folks hardly say anything. I could tell that with 11 agreements, this classroom was ready to go. And it was starting to become clear to me that a third university might be possible in this space with the ways that the students were taking hold of this classroom. And again, I want to say this caveat, this is not always the case. This is, the big point of this is in classrooms where students are ready to go, I think it's important for the professor or the instructor to get out of the way and let them go while supporting them. In other classrooms, professors need to call out oppressive stuff that's happening in the classroom and build structured pedagogy around scaffolding towards social justice. So the methods for, I'm going to share some of the what was happening in this classroom. We recorded class discussions, interviews with students, and end of quarter evaluations and art assignments. And they did research projects as well from this class that is part of our archive. I'm going to share with you the art assignments, 2 of them, and the prompt. This was a student facilitated art assignment, and the prompt that they gave was, what would the university look like if you designed it? Sort of envisioning a dreaming assignment. And let me bring up my notes on what the students said here. Okay, so this was the first one by one of the students, a Tongan student who titled this drawing the University of Tahiva, and I'll tell you what that, in the student's words, what that means. So the student said, "This art portrays my imagination of an education that centers social justice with a slight emphasis on critical Pacific Islander studies, a discipline that is often underrepresented in academia. Tahi is an indigenous Pacific island, Tongan term that means to nurture. Va, also a Tongan term that means spaces. Thus, Tahi Va means nurturing the socio-spatial relationship between people. I imagine a university that authentically centers and nurtures students to become the leaders and change makers this country desperately needs without capitalist or corporate interest. The University of Tahiva encapsulates three main ideas: equity, justice, and retention. Considering the historical oppression and marginalization of communities of color, Black folks, LGBTQAI, and Indigenous people face in the U.S., this university prioritizes equitable support for these communities." And sharing one more of the artwork from the students, the student named this Reimagining University, and they said, "In class, we were asked to reimagine university. My university would take place on a smaller scale, prioritizing community knowledge, sharing, and learning instead of capital. In this space, learning will be encouraged through the sharing of stories, space, food, medicine, and play. For these relationships of community and sharing knowledge to flourish, we must also tend to our relationship to the land. Through maintaining the symbiotic relationship with Earth, we choose to prioritize life and light and can more clearly feel our roles in our communities. In imagining a new university, I value community building knowledge." So try to run through the themes quickly. I just have a few more minutes. We had 4 themes that we found within the 7 different drawings that students made. So the first theme is valuing and centering of indigenous and marginalized knowledges. That was one of the strongest themes that came through, and that many of the students are indigenous themselves and talked about how their knowledges were not valued in the first university and should be in their dream university, and much less emphasis on the classroom space. So a lot of learning happened outside. There's an intimate relationship with land, many trees that were drawn, a reclaiming idea that this is not the land of the colonizer, but this is our land. The gardening and a symbiotic relationship. Third theme, collectivist, communal, interconnected relationship to others. Emphasis on stories and storytelling. And lastly, a healing relationship to self, inclusion of body, sports, fun, healing and medicine, especially indigenous, and interconnection with others. So just to finish up here, discussion and conclusion, students imagined this third university in their art clearly from these themes and how this relates to decolonizing work. And I would also say that they're already doing this within the university. So they have this critique of the first university that we're in, but they were already doing this. Many of them were gardeners at the university. Their activism, they were activists, and the way that they were relating to one another in the classroom showed this interconnectedness. So for us as critical teachers, pedagogues, we can look outward, but we must also look inward in this critical reflexivity. The university students' subject positions are more decolonial than perhaps ever before, and I think Christine's talk will build on this as well, that this third university is incipient, it is growing, and we need to be attending to that. And as white educators, masculine educators, part of my job is to get out of the way when students are taking a hold of the classroom. And so we need to be paying close attention to what our classroom looks like and what are the necessary methods to encourage decolonization. Thank you. Thank you to my students, and thank you for Christine.
Hey, thank you. Hi, my name is Christine Rosales. I also go by Kiki. My presentation is about a class that I taught this summer in community psychology. I also want to say I'm a PhD student at UCSC. I'm in my final year, which is really exciting because I'm a first-gen student, so to be getting this close is really good. And I also want to thank the women of color before me who presented today and bravely shared their testimonials and are paving the path in their communities and paved the path for me at this moment. So thank you, Diana, Paloma, and Silvana from earlier. So before I talk about what I did in my class, I want to give a background about the demographics. UCSC is a Hispanic serving institution. The campus is pretty diverse, with the exception that we still have severe underrepresentation of Black, African American students and American Indian students. So for me, this means that when I enter the classroom, I can expect the majority of my students are going to be students of color, and they're also going to be at other intersections of marginalized identities, for example, neurodivergence, having disability, trans, non-binary, or just under the identify as LGBTQ+, working class, undocumented, and also many students are interested in social justice, so the combination of the demographics of the university and also a lot of the classes I teach are social justice oriented, brings this demographics more into my class. Whoops, good thing the lid was on that. So I want to share this quote by Nelson Maldonado Torres, and this is from his article, 10 Theses on Coloniality and Decoloniality. And his quote is, "Coloniality aims to make it impossible for the proletariat to assume themselves as questioners, which is why the control of the means of producing knowledge is so key in modern colonial societies. This is what makes schools and universities so fundamental sites of decolonial struggle." So I hold that when I enter these classrooms, especially now that I have the privilege and opportunity to teach classes. I have to think about what does it mean that I have this privilege in this space, and also to think about coloniality and decoloniality, which is this question of who can know, who gets to speak, whose knowledge is legitimate, who gets silenced and cut off from their questions. So kind of similar to what Bob alluded to, there's some issues sometimes with classrooms or classes that give out assignments that have really good intentions to do social justice work, but sometimes have really poor outcomes. And so some of those things are lack of critical reflexivity, which has been mentioned before. Too often in psychology, a lot of people are still holding on to this idea that objectivity is this realistic thing, that you can sever your emotions, your relationship, your biases from the work that you're doing, from what you're studying. There's issues with gaze. Like, what are we looking at? Too often students with really good intentions are eager to go into communities that are experiencing oppression, but often they're going into it with just looking at the pain and damage, not looking at resilience, and then also not looking at systems of oppression and the root causes of these systemic injustices. So one thing I like to show my students to talk about issues of gaze is this photograph, and this is Tuck and Ying share this artwork with us in their article on refusal, and this is a series from Ken Gonzalez Day called Erased Lynching. So these are real historical photos of lynchings, but what he did is he photoshopped the lynch subject out of the photo so that our gaze, instead of looking at someone who's been victimized by white supremacy, we're looking at also the people, those spectators in the audience who are perpetuating white supremacy. So by reversing the gaze, we're able to lean more into transformation because we're looking at institutions, we're looking at policies, practices, and who's supporting or upholding these systems. Sending students out into communities without with very little to no understanding of history, power dynamics, or the context. Another one is commodification of knowledge, and I see this in two ways. One is that this idea that you have to, have access to the university, or you have to be in the university to have access to certain kinds of knowledges, and also the feeling around like I just need to publish as much as I can because it's going to increase my salary, and that kind of having an unethical foundation for why we do work or go into communities. And then the project paradigm, which is this idea that there's a start time and an end time for our projects. And when we're doing social justice work, it needs to be iterative, meaning like if we realize, hey, the question that we had was actually really problematic, we need to be able to go back and change the question or make changes. But in a class setting, when you have a start and end date, it doesn't really allow us to make those changes. So those are just some things that I've noticed as a student and as a teaching assistant with previous classes. So with this class, I was really intentionally going in, like, how can I put decoloniality into a community psychology agenda, and how can I use the classroom space to do activism, to do decolonial work? So this past summer, I taught community psychology, transforming communities, and it's a small class, and it's also a short class, so it's 13 students, 5 weeks. It's really more like 4 weeks, because the last week is like finals week. And so the way I structured this is their assignment was to do a scholar activist tool, but their midterm was a proposal where I had them write out in 2 pages, what is the history of the issue, what are you studying, what are you proposing, what have people in those communities have said is the needed action to be taken. That way students weren't, reinventing the wheel or coming up with things on their own, like really consulting with the knowledges of the community, and critical reflexivity. So that was an important part for me to be able to see where they were going and to give feedback and be like, hey, you need to dig deeper with this, or hey, this is kind of going in a problematic direction. And so for their final, they wrote a paper talking about how they responded to the feedback I gave, what they learned, what they grew, and also the actual scholar activist tool itself, which was intended to be disseminated and shared with the campus community. So I gave them a lot of instructions for the assignment, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to really give you like the crux of what I was asking them to do. So I said, your goal is to understand a social justice concern happening at UCSC or connected to UCSC and develop some type of action or tool that could potentially lead to transformative social change. And again, I had them do it to UCSC because I wanted them to realize that if you want to do decolonial work, you don't have to go travel overseas to be a savior. There's colonialism happening right here in the spaces you interact with every day. These are the spaces to intervene in your own backyard. And also just wanting them to have some understanding of the context, so they have already a relationship to the university by being a student there. And then think about the social justice issue and collaborate with 1 or 2 people in a group on creating a scholar activist action or tool based on what people affected by the social issue have named as necessary or relevant. So at the bare minimum, they had to do research and find like voices, like qualitative work of people naming, like, this is what the issues are, this is how these are the calls for change that we want. And at the maximum, or I at least wanted them also to try and talk to people. So for example, there were students who were interested in food insecurity on campus, and I'm like, okay, well, in addition to the literature, talk to the person who runs the food pantries on campus, because she knows, she's interacted with students. Talk to her, what does she know, what have students said? So I told students, you can create whatever you want. I gave them the idea of creating zines or a podcast, but some students created other things. So on the bottom right, some students who were tackling food insecurity on campus decided to make stickers to combat some stigma. But also I said, like, hey, like stigma, these are great things at the individual level, but can you also talk about like structures and systems? So they created a link with a website where they were talking about how this stuff is connected to larger systemic issues. Some students created zines on like mental health and like the lack of accessible mental health for students of color, especially because a lot of as mentioned in the previous panel, a lot of the therapists on campus are white. And then also housing crisis on campus. So what made this assignment decolonial? Again, most of my students in my class were students of color, so with them it was important that they understood themselves as educators by sharing their essays with others. And I should say that these students were picking issues that they had a personal relationship to. And for students who were like white or had multiple forms of privilege, it was about getting them to think about, like, okay, you have these privileges, how are you going to use it? How are you going to mobilize action and be in solidarity and intertwine risk with yourself, with people's struggles? The assignment itself challenged the commodification of knowledge by creating something that could be shared. Too often things are just kept in the classroom and they don't get to be shared beyond that classroom space. Students asked to engage in critical reflexivity repeatedly. So critical reflexivity is not just something you do one time, it's an ongoing process. So throughout the whole time I kept asking them, like, how is your relationship to this issue changing now that you're studying and researching it? What are your biases? What are some ways that you're limited? And it should be uncomfortable. Like critical reflexivity has that pedagogy of discomfort that Bob was talking about. The gaze was reversed onto the institution, making visible and denormalizing institutional practices and policies that are oppressive. So going back to food security, insecurity as an example, is there's this trope of like the broke college student, and we just accept like that's what it means to be in college, to be starving and to be struggling. And it's like if you look at budgeting and how things are allocated, if you look at systems and structures, you start to realize things don't have to be that way. So denormalizing that by reversing the gaze. Students asked to engage in the context they're embedded in, and they were asked to think about something that could lead to transformative social change. So not just putting a Band-Aid on something, but how do we actually change and push towards policy change and structural change and changes in people's practices. So I asked students, since this is the first time I explicitly was trying I was naming this decolonial paradigm as part of my agenda as an instructor. I asked them, like, how did it feel to do this work? So I have some quotes from students, couldn't include all of them because of the nature of the timed presentation. So I asked them, how did it feel to do a project that would eventually lead to a scholar activist tool? In what ways did you feel motivated or unmotivated? And one person wrote, I was very motivated to get this message out to students because I know some people will feel the anger that I felt when doing the research for this project. She was doing research on why the ethnic studies program on campus is underfunded. Another student wrote, it was very nerve-wracking actually. Most work produced in class is only seen by your teacher, maybe your classmates, but something the whole school could see used was a lot of pressure to create something of actual use that UCSC needs, to not say the wrong things. I felt motivated because this is exactly what I want to do, use my knowledge and skills to create transformative, meaningful change. In what ways did the assignment help you think about decoloniality? One person wrote, it made me think a lot about how the system and how unjust it is. This class has taught me that decoloniality is not just related to indigenous people, but can be brought into other contexts. What she means is like decolonization, decoloniality work is not just on the shoulders of indigenous people. This is something that we should all be engaging in and is relevant to our work. And then another student wrote, this assignment helped me think about reversing the gaze and combating victim blaming. And then finally I asked, would you recommend that this type of assignment be assigned in other classes? Why or why not? One person wrote, yes, this was really rewarding despite how difficult it was. I really enjoyed being able to share my work with others and have them actually understand, unlike a 15-page research paper. And then just to keep it real, you know, not everyone loved this assignment. One person wrote, it was very helpful for introducing the idea of actually implementing activism, but it only focused on a very specific topic. All of my research had to do with UCSC and funding, not necessarily decoloniality. I definitely don't think this should be assigned in another summer session. So unfortunately, she misunderstood the assignment. She thought, like, if I'm going to do decolonial work, it can't be at the university. But as Maldonado Torres has mentioned and named, is that, you know, because we're talking about knowledge and production of knowledge and who can speak and who is centered, that the university is one of those key sites. So some concluding thoughts. A 5-week summer session class is really limited in what we can do. So I think it's a little bit ambitious to do a scholar activist tool, and it has that, it enforced that project model of like, you gotta think really quick, you don't really have time to like really marinate in this. And so I try to give as much feedback as possible in their work. So I think ideally, you know, doing scholar activist tools is better suited in a class where we really have more time, like a semester or a quarter, but it can still plant seeds. So for example, I have one student who's taken this work beyond the classroom, and she's really inspired. She's a working class woman, and she notices that the parking policies on campus, a lot of students who have families, or students of color, working class students, disproportionately get parking tickets. And so she's organizing with folks and trying to change those policies. And so some other things I noticed just about, you know, what students saying, the assignment was a lot of work. And it also encouraged students to think about accountability. So a couple students were saying, like, wow, knowing that this is going to be disseminated with other people, it pushes me to like take this work seriously and to make sure that the facts I'm putting on paper or I'm podcasting are accurate, and to really think about what is the impact of the work that I'm doing. So I appreciated that assignment had some of that encouragement for them. But of course, you know, some students didn't like the assignment, and they're like, how is this decolonial? How is this, like, you know, we're here, this is not doing that. So teaching decoloniality is, in psychology, is an entire paradigm shift. And so it's going to take more time for students to grasp that, especially like, because of the colonial paradigms being so well implemented into our thinking about objectivity and all those things are really hard to undo. And that decolonial praxis is challenging, but super crucial in our classrooms. I mean, why are we here, if we're not here for doing liberatory work? And then, so I'm almost done, but I just wanted to say I didn't get a chance to talk about another class, but there's multiple models of doing scholar activism. In another class, an ethnic studies class, we did the scholar activist tool as an entire class. So even though I don't get a chance to talk about it, I have the zines that the students made, and I passed them around to some folks, but I have more copies, so if you want one at the end. This one's about resistance, especially everyday resistance, the resistance that isn't always so visible, but still important. So thank you so much. Please feel free to contact me, and I deeply appreciate any critical feedback or thoughts. Thank you. And then next is Danielle Kofelt, our third presenter, and unfortunately she was feeling sick and couldn't make it out, but she pre-recorded her presentation for us.
Hi, my name is Danielle Kofelt, and I'm so sorry I can't be there in person to participate on this panel, but thank you for making do with this pre-recorded version of my talk, Telling Stories That Matter, Arts-Based Participatory Approaches to Cultivating Empowering Community Narratives. The prevailing cultural narratives circulating about groups who have historically faced systemic forms of oppression reflect the ideological perspectives of dominant social agents. The stories transmitted through mainstream media, political rhetoric, and cultural institutions construct the targets of structural oppressions as individually responsible for their lot in life, thus legitimizing social inequities. Indeed, the power to develop, share, and disseminate stories about one's group and to have those stories taken seriously is not equitably distributed in our society. Developing modes of telling and listening to the multiple stories that make up our communities breaks down the illusion of group homogeneity and cultivates more complex narratives rooted in the lived experiences of those most impacted by social injustice. This talk draws upon several projects to showcase art-based participatory approaches to developing alternative narratives in collaboration with communities. And combining methods of storytelling with social science research methods, this presentation will illustrate how critical psychologists can partner with underheard communities to amplify their stories, democratize the production of knowledge, and affirm the value of diverse experiences and perspectives. The products created through this process focus on enhancing sense of place and sense of community, fostering dialogue, building strong relationships, and critical literacy. This is going to look different from a typical academic conference talk in that, one, I'm not actually there, but also in that I'll spend most of my time talking about processes rather than the methods or analyses of data. So what is the connection between arts and narrative? The arts, whether we're talking about visual, literary, musical, or theatrical, are not simply aesthetic or cathartic. They have transformative potential for broader communities, in part because art shapes narratives and thus shapes our worldview. Ignacio Martín Baró, a Salvadoran social psychologist, theorized that everyday events are systematically distorted in a way that constructs a reality that is ideologically compatible with the interests of the dominant class. This collective lie, or what we might call the dominant narrative, is not just one of many interpretations of reality. Instead, it becomes the only legitimate way to see the world and obstructs the development of a critical analysis because it individualizes social problems and alienates people from one another. So Martín Baró argued that people need social mirrors that reflect an alternative narrative, different ways of understanding the historical, political, and social context, more aligned with the lives of subordinated groups, which then fosters collective identity, critical consciousness, and social transformation. So, what does a social mirror actually look like? In my own work, this takes the form of participatory arts, namely public arts that are created within the process of social science research. One orientation to this is art making processes that enable people to develop the tools needed to both understand and combat oppression. Embedded in that definition is capacity building that fosters a sense of agency and critical literacy. While we often learn that the creation of art is reserved for those with innate talent and think of art as precious objects stored in museums, there is a very long history of subordinated groups using art for the purposes of empowerment and liberation, for instance, the Chicano mural movement or theater of the oppressed. Social justice art also aligns with empowerment, increased access to control over the psychological and material resources that affect one's life, not only through space claiming and enhancing social and cultural capital, but through the creation of counter-narratives that contrast and contest denigrating dominant cultural narratives about subordinated groups and communities. Control over the stories that are circulated as common knowledge about your community is an important psychological resource. I've typically approached this work through a paradigm called participatory action research, or PAR. An underlying assumption of PAR is that we can create a rigorous and socially just psychology only if the people most impacted by social problems are engaged as co-researchers in determining the direction of the research and enacting actions to address them. So I want to shift now to a few examples of what this work has looked like in practice. So I'll talk briefly about photo voice, muralism, and digital storytelling. Photo voice is a methodology in which participants take pictures based on a prompt and discuss their photographs following a structured format. So the goal here is to take a grassroots approach to study a community-based issue and to move towards social action. In some of the work I've done with elementary school children, we used photo voice in order to determine what the school would most benefit from. So I'll walk you through a quick demo of one of the first things, or the first steps I use when starting a photo voice project. Participants learn about framing, lighting, and symbolism before they start collecting their photo voice data, but even before that, we learn how to read or interpret a picture. So we'd start by just naming everything and anything you see in a picture like this. This is by Helen Levitt. And then additional questions I ask include the following questions. And any of these could lead to an entire conversation about a number of different topics, ranging from issues around social class and poverty to how conceptualizations of childhood have shifted historically and generationally, race and gender differences. And this is developing critical analysis and observation skills. And participants eventually take their own photos based on a prompt, which could be anything from what are your hopes and dreams for your community to how has the recession impacted your family. After the photos come back, participants choose a couple of pictures they feel best represent their response to the prompt and then facilitate a structured discussion based on these questions. They're also trained in qualitative data analysis and sort the pictures into thematic categories and then create written narratives. Some photo voice projects might end here and maybe have a public showing of the photos and the written narratives. Other projects might use photo voice as a means of determining what issues are most relevant to community members and then determine a way to continue working together on those issues. Photo voice often serves as a foundation for other arts-based projects as well, like muralism, a political art form in itself. For example, in one elementary school-based project, students learned through their photo voice data that many of their peers did not see their own experiences and cultures represented in the curriculum or values at the school. So we created this mural, the mural in the center here, on a huge publicly visible external wall of the school that reflects the experiences, strengths, and struggles of their mostly Latinx community. More recently, I've used digital storytelling as a means of constructing and also disseminating stories. Digital storytelling combines photos, spoken word, and music into a short, usually 2 to 3 minute video to tell a personal account of some experience. So these stories are personal to each individual who makes one, but then taken together, they can also serve as a way to highlight common experiences or struggles, while also illustrating the diversity within a common experience, within a group. So again, participants would develop a prompt and then use this as a basis for writing a short script for their digital story. And then for folks who struggle with this process, we use story writing prompts like this is an I am from poem that can then serve as fodder for a more focused story about home or community in this case. One group I worked with in the past in a university context was Class Beyond the Classroom at Bridgewater State University. We held a digital storytelling workshop in which students and faculty created a story based on some aspect of their experience of being a first generation or financially insecure college student. But I'll just play you one example of this kind of digital story so you have a sense of what these look like.
Leaving for college meant no more family nights, no more baseball, no more arroz con gandules. But my family is adventurous. On a whim, my father risked his own life and sailed for 3 days on a quest to Puerto Rico, where he met Mom. 7 years later, after only minutes of conversation, they decided to move to Kansas City. And a week later, we boarded the plane with a one-way ticket to the U.S. Going to college was my big adventure, and my family made it possible. Knowing nothing about meatpacking, Dad took up a new job in a different state to pay for my tuition. And every time I clicked submit to payment, I felt parasitic. While I enjoyed having my own car during my senior year of high school, my brother never had that chance. His car was sold just to pay for my tuition, and every time he took the yellow school bus, I felt I was robbing him of an experience. My mom and brother moved to a shabby yet more affordable apartment just to pay for my tuition. And when they went weeks without heat during the winter months, I felt I was to blame. It seemed like home was fleeing. Did I deserve their sacrifice? Why did I go to college? My brother found a new home, and Mom moved in with Dad after getting a job at the same factory. Home was both fleeing and constant. It was physical, yet invisible. And as I helped move in first-year students during orientation, I knew I was home, and I'm learning to deserve it.
All right, so a series of these stories were then screened at various campus events and served as a basis for discussion about first-gen experiences and how to create a more supportive institution. You can tell just from this one story, there are issues about, sense of deservingness, this issue of leaving one's family or one's community in order to pursue higher education and the complications associated with that, social class. So a lot of different issues that you could cover. So a couple of takeaways. So as a de-ideologizing tool, arts-based participatory methods can contribute to shifting narratives that are more representative of the lives and experiences of underheard groups. And we can conceptualize these approaches in terms of both empowering processes and products, and they help answer the question of how our research can extend beyond the more conventional products like journal articles or even conference presentations. And anyone can be involved in this work. These methods foster community members' agency by casting them as experts on their own lives. And then in terms of critical psychology, I think we need to also consider how these actions, or some might call these interventions, are taken up, and for whom, for what purposes. I've seen many of these sorts of projects co-opted or used as a means of showing dominant groups what it's like to experience life as someone who's othered. So the purpose cannot only be to use or to objectify subordinated experiences in service of teaching those with privilege about their own privilege. So I'd like to think instead about how these might be used to build solidarity or accompliceships. Also, public art, especially murals, have been part of the neoliberal commodification of urban areas, often through attempts to invest private capital in beautification efforts that attract certain bodies to an area for the purposes of economic growth or economic benefit, and attempt to exclude others. So again, it's critical that when we partner with communities in this work, we're thinking about the repercussions and the historical context of the work that we're doing for everyone. So with that, thank you very much for your attention. And if you'd like to connect or be in touch, please feel free to send me an email. Thank you.
Okay, well, I want to first thank you both, well, thank you all for the great presentations and the powerful work you do. And we have just under 10 minutes here for some questions from the audience. If anybody would like to come up and ask any questions of either presenter. While you're warming up your questions, I have one. Thinking I'm very interested in this kind of work, and I work here at Northern New Mexico College, and as a broad access public institution, most of our students are taking, we have like a pretty set general education kind of framework, and particularly interested in how to get first year students engaged in this kind of work. So I would love to hear your thoughts about how within kind of the traditional curricular framework, we're dealing with students taking intermediate algebra, introduction to sociology, psychology, and maybe comp, first year experience, with like the kind of standardized curriculum. Where might opportunities be to engage students in this kind of work?
It's a great question. So my talk was about this class that's upper division and supported by a very radical provost, and so it's already set there. And so I think you're talking about how can some of the more like general elective courses integrate social justice and specifically decolonization. And I don't have great answers for that. I do teach a first year course. It's basically a first year comp course. And I think looking at the different assignments that comp has around sort of critical thinking and trying to really expand that aspect of comp, and then we can get to social justice aspects of critical thinking is one way that I think about doing it. I also do teach Psych 1, and I teach the sort of social and personality part of it, and I've looked for sort of what are the radical elements in there, and actually a lot of social psychology parts of it teach sort of or the implications are that prisons are fundamentally awful places, so there's a sort of prison abolition in there if it can be elevated out. So I try to do that too. I think as administrators, I think it's important to work with administrators and talk with them about our classrooms, who's in our classrooms. First generation initiatives are really important, and at our school I think can start to expand curricula to go to more social justice places.
Is mine working? Oh, it's mine. How's mine working? Just to add to that, I think sometimes I run into, when I teach interdisciplinary classes where students are taking math or history or all these things, sometimes I think students tell me like, oh, well, my field has nothing to do with social justice. And I'm just like, social justice can be part of any curriculum. Like, for example, if you're thinking biology or the sciences, science has had a long history of doing really crappy work. Think about the HeLa cell, Henrietta Lacks, and how her body matter was used for science in a way that was really problematic. Thinking about math, like, oh, what does math have to do with social justice? Well, think about how numbers are used. And I know there's a course at UCSC that uses the book, The New Jim Crow by Jackie Alexander, to talk about statistics and to talk about math. I think also part of it is who are you citing in your syllabus? Like, what readings are you including? Are you including the works of like traditional, like old white guys? It's like work that's outdated, or are you citing like the works of like revolutionaries, like women of color, and people who are like youth, and people who maybe don't have like a status or label, like a PhD or whatever behind their name, but are theorizing and doing this work. I also think about in my classes, like when I think about first gen, like being a first gen myself, I think I got really intimidated a lot by some of the readings and put off by it. I remember in high school, like I didn't like politics class because I didn't understand what was going on and like the language that they were using. And then I started reading some works that like really spoke to me just in the language, the way they were talking. So I think thinking about like having readings that are not always so like in the brain. Like, for example, in my healing justice class, I have people read The Body is Not an Apology, which is just as like theoretically rigorous as some things you would find online, but is written in like everyday, like accessible language. So those are some things I think about with like how do you do decolonial work in any field or for like first gen or entering students.
I just wanted to, my question was going to be the one you answered. So thank you, because I've taught math and I'm in sort of some of the sciences as well as humanities, and I wanted to know how you thought about how we could get something into the other STEM courses, basically. So you gave me some thoughts immediately. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Do we have any other questions?
Don't be shy.
Thank you so much. That was really inspiring as I think about just continuing to develop coursework. I think in some of my experiences as someone trying to develop similar courses, I found myself actually, unfortunately, audited by students, particularly white students, white cis straight students, and that's been really challenging and painful as a queer non-binary person of color, and I grapple with the power I hold with that grade and how that has at the end of the day to navigate the audit, how like I've dealt with that. So I'm just curious if either of you can speak to those experiences and how you navigate it, because I just feel pretty shitty at the end of the day with it.
My positionality is so different as a white cis man, and so my experiences, what I have to say, I don't know matter that much to your question. I do. In the comp class, the provost and I talk, and she puts problematic students in my, or like white students who take up a lot of space into my classes, and what I do is in the first week of class, I talk with them and say that they have to come visit me in office hours and start a dialogue there. And that helps a lot, where I think they're, maybe for the first time, they're coming up against social justice issues and they are having a lot of fragility come up. And so coming to my classroom or coming to my office hours helps them not feel attacked, I guess. And I notice in those spaces they can actually listen, and then and then I tell them that they need to not do that in the classroom space. So for other white educators out there, I think that is really important, that we as accomplices reach out and say, we want those students, even though those students can be really challenging. I think that's an important practice that we can take up.
Yeah, I struggle with that a lot. Actually, on the first day of that class that I taught, I had a white male student corner me and intimidate me, and they eventually ended up like picking up their things, slamming the door, and leaving. And I was like, okay, good riddance. But I was, my heart was racing with the fact of like, what if they had stayed, because they were taking up that space and like laughing and smirking at the things that I was saying that was like really serious stuff that they were taking as a joke. So it's something that it's really hard for me to do. And in that moment, I felt so vulnerable. Like, I'm the instructor in this class, and yet I felt like really powerless. I think part of what I do, I don't have the answer in every situation, but I'm glad you raised the question, because I also want to reach out to community and ask, like, what do different folks do in different situations? But for me, like, on the first day, similar to Bob, I have community agreements, and I really, like, ask the question, like, how do we want to be in this space? And I am kind of explicit about, like, you know, like, there are certain things in this class where students with certain privileges shouldn't be really taking up the space. Like, there are moments in this class where this space is for you, and sometimes there's moments in the class where it's not for you. And so I think that sometimes students have a hard time hearing that, but it's one of those things that I make explicit, and the students who are not cool with that tend to leave, like the person on the first day. And I just pray that they always leave, and if they're not willing to you know, be in line with the course agreements and not be in solidarity with the work. And I have had some experiences where, like Bob, I had to pull people aside and talk to them, and luckily, like, I've had some positive responses, but it doesn't always work out. But I just think naming, like, this is what this class is about. This is acceptable behavior. This is non-acceptable behavior. But I still have moments where I'm just like, shit, I don't know what to do. So.
I don't know how this works, because we are at official time, but I just do see we have a question. I don't know. I'm looking at. Go for it. Yeah, let's do this.
So my question is actually from a different view of this. I'm wondering, I have an 11-year-old daughter who I am trying to raise to be an activist in her classroom, and I'm wondering, as a parent, what your thoughts are about how to support her advocating for her own space and thinking around these topics in her classroom. She's 11, so she's in 6th grade, and we're already talking about these things, and I'd like for that conversation to continue, but I guess I'm bumping up against questions in the administration, and I'm just wondering, how do I take what you're saying about being a teacher in the classroom as being her mother and a teacher outside of the classroom, and kind of bringing those things together?
Neither of us have kids. So it feels like a challenging question, and I don't feel like personally it's my place. Like, you're her mother, like, you know best, and you're here at this conference. Like, I can already tell you're doing this work. You helped co-organize this conference. Yeah. You know, like, you're doing the work, and like, for example, and kind of related to the zine I passed around, one thing that gets talked about resistance is this idea that you have to have a certain, like, consciousness, like political consciousness. Like, my mother didn't talk about Foucault, didn't talk about Fanon, but yet, like, just watching her, I felt empowered, like, you know, seeing her struggle, seeing her, like, fight back and resist. And so I defer to you. You're the expert, and she's watching you and learning from you. Mm-hmm.
Thank you both, or all.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Okay.
All right, so we have a short break, and then our second keynote speech starts at 3 o'clock.
Check.